Hello everybody and welcome to video 2 in a set of videos that will help you in writing your first DBQ or document-based question essay. In this video I will be helping you or walking you through the process of basically somewhat of pre-writing. I will do a lot of it or help you with a lot of it, but some of it I will expect you to do totally on your own. So maybe you should have out your DBQ pre-writing packet while you are looking over this video. All right, so remember, the first thing that you do when you see a document-based question is to look at the question and make sure you know exactly what it's asking. So if you look, the question is the header. The Constitution represents the subversion of the revolution. Assess the validity of the statement. So right off the bat, you know this is a kind of a to what extent question. It's asking to what extent did the Constitution, as written in 1788, 89, and ratified, to what extent did it go against or undermine the values and principles for which the patriots or the rebels fought the Revolutionary War? Okay, and right away you should be thinking, okay, all right, we went a little bit from classical republicanism, which is this right here, revolution, to classical liberalism in the Constitution. Right, so we were motivated by classical republicanism over here in the revolution, classical liberalism in the Constitution. Okay, now, again, these are basic directions that remind you what you should be doing on a DBQ. If they're there on test day, don't even bother looking at them because you should know this stuff already. It's just a waste of time if you don't know it already. But basically, you are to state a relevant thesis. You are to support that thesis using evidence from all or all but one of the documents, so 6 or 7 of the docs. You are to incorporate all of them, or all but one, of the docs into your argument, and kind of implicitly within your usage of the docs, you are to show that you understand one of these 4 things: the intended audience, the purpose, the historical content, and or the point of view of the author of the doc. Okay? Now, when I'm going to be going over these 7 docs, and I'm going to be posting this document online as well next to the video, okay? I'm not going to say, well, the point of view here is, the context here is. It'll be implicit in what I write about each of the documents, as it should be implicit in what you write in the essay. All right? You are to support your argument or your claim or claims with analysis of historical examples from outside the documents. So outside knowledge, and just so you know, in these comments, outside knowledge is okay, meaning that's the abbreviation, outside knowledge, okay. So I wouldn't have to type it out each time. And you are to connect historical phenomena, just events from history, processes, events, people that are relevant to your argument, to broader events or processes. This is sort of maybe what you do in your intro or your conclusion, and you talk about why it's important that we look at this and why we know about this. And you are to synthesize or combine all the documents, all this stuff, documents, outside knowledge, into a persuasive essay or an argumentative essay, it should say. Okay? So now let's get to the 7 documents. So document A, we have Amos Singletary, 1788. Now, most of us in the world have never heard of Amos Singletary. So we know nothing about him right off the bat. You know what? You're not supposed to. All right? If you are a junior in high school and you know who Amos Singletary was, you probably should be more advanced into college years. But you're not supposed to. All right? So the important thing is the date here. Whoops. I did it again. The date, 1788. That should tell you right away, this is during the ratification of the Constitution debates. Okay? So I'll give you a second to read over the document, and you can pause the video to read it. I'm not going to read it just because I only have 15 minutes to get this all done. So after reading the document, I know, and again, this would be point of view, by the way, he was an anti-federalist. Again, a hint was the date. So, and what it says in the actual document. So this was during the debate about ratification. He's warning about the elite-driven Constitution. And I could use this to support a claim that the Constitution favored the elite or a strong central government. And that, in fact, would be subverting the revolutionary era. Okay, but it's one of the things we've thought about is this idea of equality. Okay. Now, the outside knowledge I could bring in is the whole anti-federalist argument about how the Constitution is what we were fighting against. In other words, this is a quote from one guy, a guy who we don't even know. Okay, it could be some chubby guy living in his mom's basement. Who knows? All right. All we can use this for is to support the argument, other evidence we have that the Constitution favored the elite. You know, to point out that guys back then thought so. All right. And we can say much the same thing about document B here. Richard Henry Lee. Now, a couple of you might know who he is. If you've seen the HBO miniseries John Adams, he's the guy with the bandages on his head in the Constitutional Convention. I'm sorry, the Continental Congress. But again, you probably don't know who he is. But judging by the date, it's the same as Doc A. He's an anti-federalist, and he's worried here about the oligarchic or elitist nature of the Constitution. An oligarchy is a government run by the wealthy, and it's usually a derogatory term, meaning they're not doing a good job. Okay? It's like a tyranny by the elite, more or less. All right? And you can use it much the same way as the first one. You know, guys back then were thinking this. So, again, same as Doc A. It can be used as further support of the claim, as mentioned above, but only to point out that we can look back at some of the commentary during the ratification debate to ascertain the extent to which the Constitution may have subverted the revolution. That is, we need more concrete evidence. What is the evidence they, as in the Anti-Federalists? So go back to your white papers. What evidence did they point to argue the Constitution would be elite? Okay? See the outside knowledge above, you know, what I mentioned up here, the whole anti-federalist argument. So the one rep for every 30,000 people, the distance argument, all those things they said about the elite taking over or having an undue influence in government. All right? So A and B can help you support that, but the more concrete evidence is what the anti-federalists gave you that you should have used for the white paper. All right? So now let's get to document C. All right? Now, this is a chart that was made by the Gilder Lehrman Institute. I don't remember when they made it. Who cares? Nevertheless, it was well after the fact because they didn't even exist back then, so we know it's much more recent. All right? This is basically a simple chart that tells you the composition of state assemblies in the 1780s. Now, this is the hint right here, 1780s. That should tell you right away that the Articles of Confederation was the governing document up until the very end. All right. Now, what you should notice in this document is that, for the most part, you should say to yourself, okay, of these 5 categories, who's elite, who's non-elite? All right. So we have professionals. They're definitely the elite. All right. They're elite. And large landowners are the elite right here. Okay. We have 2 elite categories, and we have farmers, we have artisans, and we have merchants. That and merchants, you can say, are the elite too. I'm sorry. Landowners, professionals, and merchants are the elite. Okay. Now, farmers and artisans are not. Okay. Artisans ranged in wealth from like low-level, middling artisans, and there were some artisans who were pretty well off. But remember, it was a differential society. So an artisan who was well off didn't make it into the social elite circles of the professionals, the merchants, and the landowners. And we know the farmers were not elite because it says large landowners. Okay, if a farmer was like Thomas Jefferson, who, you know, he was a farmer, and so was John Adams, but they were both elite. Why was Jefferson elite? Because he was also a large landowner. All right, so when we say farmer, they mean yeoman, small farmer. Okay, and the trend that you should notice from this is that, especially in the North, these top 3 states, during the Articles, the non-elite were winning out in the state assemblies. Not as much in the South, all right, but more so in the North. We were becoming more democratic if you define that as more of a variety of people in the state assemblies, middling to lower people in the state assemblies, okay? So you can argue in your essay that we were moving towards a greater democracy during the Articles, and the Constitution pulled that back. All right, so this can help you. This is some concrete evidence to help you in your argument that document A and B help support. All right, so the U.S., I have the note over here, The U.S. was becoming more democratic during the Articles of Confederation, which we just talked about. If you look at the numbers, you tally up farmers and artisans versus these three, and the farmers and professionals will be more. Okay. The U.S. was becoming more democratic during the Articles. This supports the claim that the Constitution moved us in the direction of becoming less democratic when brought up in conjunction with the arguments from documents A and B, the old elite argument. All right, so let's move on to Doc D. All right, now this is a little bit of a smoking gun document. All right, you got to remember. You look at the author here, Alexander Hamilton, 1787. So Federalist Papers, debate over ratification of the Constitution. That should tell you right away. All right, and if you read the document, and again, if you want to read it before I talk about it, pause it. I'm going to keep on going, but you can press the pause button. Okay, but again, like I said, this is a little bit of a smoking gun document, and he says, the first are the rich and well-born, the other the mass of the people. The people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. Give, therefore, to the first class, the rich, a distinct permanent share in the government. They will check the unsteadiness, the inability of the second, the commons, the masses, as they cannot receive any advantage by change. Okay, meaning the wealthy don't benefit if there's a ton of change. So they'll be stable. All right, they will maintain good government. All right, so this is more about elitism of the Constitution from Hamilton himself. And why is it a strong piece of evidence? Why is it better than Docs A and B? Because it is from one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, the most famous set of documents to support the Constitution. Okay? Now, some outside knowledge you can bring in here. Hamilton, admittedly, he was closer to being a monarchist than all the other Federalists. So, on one level, this isn't as great a piece of evidence. Yeah, it is. It's a very good piece of evidence. But you should qualify in your essay by saying, to be sure, Hamilton was more of a monarchist and thus more elitist than all the other Federalists. All right, so it kind of, you admit that, you anticipate someone else's response. Yeah, but Hamilton was a monarchist. He wasn't like Madison or John Jay. You say, yeah, but it still does suggest the elitism of the Constitution if someone like Hamilton supported it. Okay, so you mention their argument and you talk it down. Okay, again, it does suggest the elitism of the Constitution if someone like Hamilton, as close to a monarchist as he was, if even he supported it, it does suggest there was some truth to what Docs A and B were saying, to the anti-federalist argument that it was elitist. All right, and you can also add nuance by using Hamilton's argument that the elite make better reps. You remember from the white papers? Okay. In other words, there should be a section in your essay where you argue that it did not subvert. All right, and you could say, okay, Hamilton did say it was elitist, and on one level that does subvert the revolution, but on another level, he did argue they made better reps. He did think they represented the people better than themselves. And you bring up that argument he made in that last Federalist paper we read. Okay. All right, guys. Now let's get on to document E. This is Alexis de Tocqueville, 1835. Should tell you right away. This is well after the debate about ratification. So again, you can press pause and read the doc, but I'm going to keep on going. He was a visitor to the United States after the fact, many years after the Constitution, and it was during the Market Revolution. Now, this more or less, this whole document outlines the classical liberal argument, and I would use it in a section that points out things about the Constitution that does not subvert the revolution. This section right here. Arguing the common good wins out in the end. In your section where you argue it did not subvert, you should be arguing that the Federalists, the Constitution, dealt more in reality, meaning the way we really were as people. Their main argument was that we are self-interested and we've got to design a government that is based around that self-interest. Okay? All right, so since they argued that their end product did create the common good, that's how they frame their argument that these self-interested acts equal stability, equal the common good, and you could not base a government around the notion that we could be virtuous. All right. So in the end, it does not subvert liberty, subvert the revolution, the Federalists would argue, or you should argue in that section of your essay. All right. So what I have over here is he was a visitor to the U.S. after the fact, many years after the Constitution. And this is part of the reason why I waited so long to have this done. It was during the American Revolution. And as you may remember from class, the 1820s to 30s to 40s is when Hamilton's vision really began coming to the forefront. So it makes sense that Tocqueville was here in 1835, and he saw these things. All right. So again, this is the classical liberal argument, and I can use this in a section that points out things about the Constitution that do not subvert the revolution. All right. That it creates virtuous habits without the person actually being virtuous. All right. So in the end, it creates the same thing, basically, is what the Federalists would argue. And again, I know I keep bringing up the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists, and you could bring them up in your essay, but this, in essence, is not the same as your two white papers. I'm just saying that the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist argument can help you write these essays, and I will talk more about that later. So let's get to document F. We have two more docs. This is a secondary source. Again, this is a new thing on the DBQ that you might be getting. It isn't just primary sources anymore. And this was written by Alan Gibson in 2009. Tells you nothing. The date and the author tells you nothing. But again, if you read the actual quote here, this is Gibson talking. And again, you can pause this and read it so you know what I'm referring to when I talk over here. But the man who he's quoting here, New Science of Politics, State of Nature, and so forth, the moderns, he's quoting Hamilton from the Federalist Papers, and we read them. This exact phrase was in the Federalist Papers that we read. So Gibson describes the classical liberal argument as found in Hamilton's Federalist Papers that you analyzed and wrote about for your white papers. He's quoting Hamilton, and the founders he referred to right here, or actually I added that word, are the writers of the Constitution. All right, which many historians call the second founding. The first founding being the Revolution, the second founding being the Constitution. And this can be used to support the claim that the supporters of the Constitution were trying to save liberty from our self-interested human nature. The old giving up a little liberty to save liberty line of reasoning. So I can frame this as, quote, and you can use these exact words. It's okay in your essay. Quote, on the surface, it appears that the Constitution, with its focus on self-interest and de-emphasis of personal virtue, does, on one level, stray from revolutionary-era principles. But on another level, it was, in the eyes of many, a more realistic way to work toward the common good. Now, this could be used, as I'm reading it, I'm realizing it could be used as a thesis statement for your whole essay, or a topic sentence for the section about how the Constitution does not subvert. That's how I would use it. All right, I would use this as my introductory sentence to that section of the essay. And you can too, it's all right. All right. But that's essentially what Hamilton is talking about. We now know better. We used to think this way. Now we know better. Our government is more realistic, and it will be just as good as everyone being virtuous. Ambition will check ambition. All right. Well, look at here. He concentrated on what men do and accepted them as they are. This also, by the way, this writing by Gibson is a very good example of how you use quotations that flow within your text, not being overly dependent on quotations. That's what that video we watched in class when we were looking at the DBQ PowerPoint, that's what he meant by don't quote. He meant don't overquote. Okay? Now, the last document from a book called Antiquity Surpassed, written by Paul Ray, a rather interesting fellow. He's still alive. I saw him lecture a couple of years ago. He made some pretty off-color jokes about women. They didn't like it too much. But he wrote a book called Antiquity Surpassed in 1994. And in this excerpt, he quotes John Adams in a letter he writes to Mercy Otis Warren. All right. Now, who cares about that? What you should care about here is John Adams. Off the bat, all right. Classical republicanism, virtue. All right. And again, you can pause it. And again, the date should tell you something. This is the Revolutionary era. So maybe this document is a clue into the way people were thinking during the Revolution. All right. So pause it, read the doc, and if you want to, before I talk about it. But his letter to Mercy Otis Warren is a classical Republican argument. You know, there must be a positive passion for the public good, the public interest, honor, power, and glory, yada yada. And this public passion must be superior to all private passions. That's the old Republican argument that people should be able to sacrifice private good for public good, for common good. Men must be ready to pride themselves and be happy to sacrifice their private pleasures when they stand in competition with the rights of society or the common good. Okay? So, I'm going to need to write a paragraph that describes the principles, the revolutionary principles, that were the impetus behind the rebellion. In other words, if I'm going to argue that something was and or was not subverted, I've got to describe what it is being or not being subverted. So I'm going to need a paragraph that basically outlines the values and principles for which the Patriots fought. And again, do not end your sentence with the preposition. Do not say fought for. Okay? So I can use this to argue, and I'm right here now, I can use this to argue that there was a great emphasis on virtue during the Revolutionary era. Classical republicanism. And this is a usable doc because Adams was a major rebel. Major patriot, I should say. I make him sound like a bomb-throwing radical when I say major rebel. More so than, if you go to documents A and B, more so than these two guys. You know, if these guys were had enough of an influence over national thought, we would have heard of them. All right. So this document, oh, I'm sorry, I went too far. This document right here, at least the part of it that quotes Adams, is very important because of how significant he was. All right. So I can use this to in that section of basically my second paragraph, my first body paragraph, in which I outline what values and principles motivated us to fight. All right. But I can add nuance or complexity to my argument by pointing out that since Adams was afraid of the rage for profit and commerce, because if you write here, this is if you read here, this was Ray talking about Adams. He was afraid that the rage for profit and commerce, so evident among all ranks and degrees of men, even in America, he was afraid it would be fatal to liberty's cause. For he had learned from studying the ancients that the spirit of commerce is incompatible with that purity of heart and greatness of which is necessary for a happy republic. In other words, that rage for profit and commerce was already so evident. So you can add nuance by saying, okay, he was afraid of this rage for profit and commerce in 1776. The self-interested quest for profit was present even back then. So, enough so that Adams was afraid of it. So you can say, all right, then there was this kind of incipient or developing classical liberalism among people in 1776. All right, enough so that Adams was afraid of it. So were the writers of the Constitution, were they onto something? Were they correct that they were being more realistic when arguing that we are self-interested by nature? This suggests that maybe they were. So you can use this part in your first body paragraph where you outline why we fought, but use this part in the section where you talk about how it does not subvert. Say, see, that rage was already there. All right, so on that level, it did not subvert. It was there. How could it subvert what was already there? Okay, maybe Madison and Hamilton were onto something. Okay, all right, guys. So time for me to talk about a suggested sample thesis. This by no means has to be your thesis. You can use these exact words. It's okay. You can plagiarize me. This is your first one. You will not get this for any others, but it's okay for this one. And again, this is just a suggested. The rebels were motivated on a concrete level by issues of taxation and a desire for self-government through local self-representation. That's the concrete level. On an abstract, philosophical, or intellectual level, the patriots were primarily motivated by ideas that can be characterized as classical republicanism. So see, I put primarily, which leaves room for me to mention that rage for profit and commerce that was evident, but not primary. In the final analysis, the Constitution does subvert many of those ideals and values, which I mentioned here, while at the same time, and in modified form, serving to protect the liberties for which the rebels fought. So in doing this, I can describe the ways it does subvert by referring to the classical Republican arguments, and I can talk about ways it did not subvert by talking about the classical liberal arguments for this section. So this is a thesis that structures the entire essay by allowing you to elaborate on all that is mentioned. Okay? Now, I mentioned before how this is not a paper of anti-federalist versus federalist. All right, so the anti-federalist argument will help because their arguments against the Constitution were wrapped around what they argued were the motivations to fight the war and how the Constitution was going against that. That is, their fear of elitism, their fear of a distant and shadowy strong central government. Okay, so while you shouldn't use the word, you can bring them up, but don't wrap your essay around the phrase anti-federalist. Just use their arguments to help you. The federalist argument will help because they argued that they now learned more about human nature and have thought up a system, checks and balances, large republic, that will save liberty from what they thought was a mess. In other words, because our human nature was self-interested, we cannot have too much democracy, which is what it was under the Articles, local self-government, because our self-interestedness will lead that to collapse. All right, so they were pulling back democracy a little bit to save it in their minds. All right. Nuance and complexity. Now, my suggested outline for this essay. You begin, obviously, with your introduction, your thesis, intro of your topic sentences. You talk about the importance of the issue. This is how you get that point. Okay, talk about why it's important. It's who we are as a people. We have classical liberalism and we have classical republicanism in us, in our brains, collectively, at the same time. All right. All right, now body paragraph 1, we outlined the values and principles for which the rebels fought. Like I said, you need that paragraph where you outline why we fought. So you can argue it was and or was not subverted. Okay? They fought for consent of the governed. We were being taxed but not represented. Parliament was distant, overbearing. It was a faraway, strong government. People wanted local self-government. They believed democracy was served best by local independent farmers who governed themselves. Classical republicanism, I show the word classical here. People are virtuous. Let me write that. People are virtuous. England is corrupt. Government doesn't need to be strong and centralized. All men are created equal. Unalienable rights, life, liberty, and property. Protection of property. And to protect economic interests. All right, now the second body paragraph is where I would write about how ways in which it was subverted. The revolution was subverted. Okay, and you can read through all of this. If you have any questions, please ask. All right, and the last paragraph, the last body paragraph would be my section of ways it did not subvert. And again, you can read through this. If you have any questions, ask. Okay, but this outlines it all for you. And in your conclusion, you talk about how you demonstrate and supported your thesis. All right. Maybe you want to rewatch videos on the VBQ website. If you have any questions, please ask, and I hope this helped.